Hello, my name is John Cutler, and in this video, we're going to talk about high work in progress and other challenges. One thing I've noticed about talking about high work in progress is that people can be confused about what you're saying. They think it means you're suggesting people don't try, or don't work hard, or aren't ambitious. And that's not really the case. So that's one reason I'm going to dig into these topics in this video to try to make it more visual and understandable. Okay, let's get started. So I think most people can relate to this scenario. They are focusing on a task and they get interrupted at this point, and there's this switching cost, and they jump to this next thing, and then they attempt to switch back to what they're doing and they go back to doing what they're doing. Most people can relate to this, right? There is that moment where you're context switching, you have to get started on the next thing, you're interrupted, you have to get reset and go back to the next thing. Cool. Understandable for most people. Okay, let's keep going. Now, in this example, you might have two people. Person one is working on task A and person two is working on task B. They hit this spot where person working on task A asks the person working on task B a question, and that person sort of gets interrupted. And the person working on the original task gets kind of slowed down while they're waiting for that answer. And then there's some switching costs as this person goes up to help, and then switching costs as this person goes back and they get back on their task. Okay, next one. Now, this is kind of interesting. Maybe one person is working on something and they're working away on task A, and then someone says, you have to start planning this other thing. So they stop what they're doing and start planning. And then once they're done planning, they go back to what they're doing and they keep working on that. And then this thing, goes, and then eventually gets started. But look at what's happening right here. They are incurring a fair amount of tax or switching costs to do that upfront planning. And even then, once they start planning that thing, it's a long time before they get to start that thing. So you can see the waste building up here. This is a classic. This team is moving at trying to get task A done. And some other group of people said, oh, we're going to get ahead of those people and we're going to get some context about this new thing. So you see they're working on B here. When they finish this thing, they attempt to go and help with task B. But of course, since they weren't involved in the beginning, there's this big hit on them getting up to speed on the context of this new thing. So you can see the tax right there. And then they keep working away on B. Now, meanwhile, those two other people, well, they're starting to get ahead of the next thing, which perpetuates this problem where they think it's going to be more efficient if they can do this upfront planning. But ultimately, the time it takes for the other team or other part of the team to get up to speed and get the new context means that they're incurring this hit every time they do that. Here's a very classic one. This big team is deciding to do two things at once. One thing is higher value and one thing is lower value. Question at that point becomes, why aren't more people working on the high value thing? Now, teams will come up with many reasons around why that's the case, but here's what they aren't really considering, right? If they did decide to work on that high value thing, yeah, maybe it wouldn't go half the amount of time because it might be harder to get four people to work on things. But if they were to do that, they would get the value of task A out into the market, generating value, and they would start then B. So really what the team in this case is missing is that getting that high value thing out there earlier is worth the tax of trying to get people to collaborate. And I would argue that when people collaborate, they come up with better solutions anyway. In this case, the team starts A, and then they get some kind of fire drill to start on B. And you can see what happens here, right? I mean, this is the classic thing where they're going to take a hit, they're going to try to get B done, then they're going to go back. But really, the whole point here is that they incur this tax when they have to get back up to speed on A. It's probably been a week or two or three or a couple months or two or three or whatever since they were working on A. And you can't just get back to A immediately. You need to get up to speed. So they incur a hit right here. Next, here's a good one. This team says, hey, I think we're done. We're going to ship it and we're going to move on to B. But they didn't really get A done. And suddenly you see them having to do this work. Maybe they cut corners to get this thing out. And then they've started this next thing, but that creates this big cascade of problems at this point, right? They're working on B, but then they have to switch back to A, and they're working on B, and they've switched back to B. And all the time they have to get context back as they're working on these things. And what would have happened if they just had focused on A and just tied up loose ends and then went to B? That would have been a better idea, but we don't do that in many cases. We think, okay, we're just going to ship it and move on. How hard can it be? And you can see what happens in this case. Next, team A rushes to get something done. They get done and they say, well, we're going to collect feedback. Okay, that is reasonable. They're getting feedback out there and then they start B. But if they wait too long to act on this feedback, it starts going downhill. The value of that feedback, because it gets disconnected and there's high context costs to get back into it, and the team loses track of what they were doing with A, becomes less valuable. So what should they have done? Well, maybe they should have just stuck with A up to about here and then acted on that feedback before going to B. This one's one of my favorites. Annual planning basically puts a bunch of things in progress. You don't think about it like that because we're planning. How hard can that be? But look at what's happening. They start on A, and then meanwhile, these plans are going stale this whole time, and they're sitting in people's mind, and they're being mentioned in meetings, and they're being put in decks this whole time. And yeah, they start B a while later, and then they start C a while later. But teams routinely imagine that they only have one thing in progress in this case. But they actually have all these other things they planned in progress in their mind and in reports and in expectations, and that is a tax. Next one, the classic thing that most people do is that they'll work on one thing until they get blocked, and they're like, oh, I got to start something else. Okay, so they start the next thing. Then they get blocked on that, and they start the next thing. And before they know it, they have 3 things in progress. Seems pretty pragmatic to me, but ultimately, do you remember to go back and unblock yourself when you're doing that? Or remember to go back and unblock yourself there? Or ask for help? Probably not. So you can see how you can quickly develop a number of things in progress. And then finally, this one takes a little bit to wrap your head around, but what's happening here is that, let's say the team has accumulated debt. You could think of debt as work in progress, but you haven't really acknowledged it yet. It's sort of an inventory of things to fix to be able to go as fast as you need to go. So this debt is sitting here, and every once in a while, it slows teams down. So you can see this orange thing. Maybe if the debt wasn't there, they could have finished right here. But no, they're still going as they do that. So the debt is incurring this tax. And you could say, well, is that high work in progress? If we think that the debt was the function of leaving things unfinished or unwrapped up, maybe that is the case. Hopefully you found this interesting. Thank you.